So, a common request that I've been getting from people has been to talk about the state of the legions as a whole, and more in particularly related to a thing which is sort of a trend in hobbying where we talk about things in terms of tier lists. How good is this? How good is that? And after seeing like the 4th or 5th or 7th or 12th video pushed to me by the YouTube algorithm about seeing other people do their tier lists, I decided it was time to do a tier list of my own. However, I don't really know that I agree with tier lists for a narrative game because if you like the Legion, you don't need a tier list. You just need help making something that's interesting. Or maybe need help trying to find something that you yourself will get good inspiration from. So without ado, the Ineptus Astartes tier list, based upon one nerd's opinion of the Horus Heresy lore so far. I was there the day that Horus slew the Emperor. It's a great line to start off the whole series, and it's a great place for us to start on this tier list. The Sons of Horus are a fantastic place for the novels to start. The first 3 books of the series are in fact entirely about the story of Loken, who is a member of the Mournival, which is that advisory group that works with Horus, his closest advisors. And it's a really great story. It introduces us to the setting of the Great Crusade. It gets us into the novels as a whole, and it kicks off the beginning of the heresy. One of the things that I was curious about when I started reading this series, the established lore of the Horus Heresy has been around for a really long time. And so when they decided to start writing these books, we knew that some things were going to be, they were going to have to be established. Obviously, there's some things they can tweak, but some of the big moments the fans would know because we kind of know these stories. So they've just been dealing with some heavy foreshadowing, a lot of moments that show us just how rough things are going to be for the Sons of Horus, for those characters who are still loyal to the Emperor, because we know, and that foreshadowing, that dread, it actually adds to the tragedy. And I want to give the Black Library, Games Workshop, and the writers props for that. Now, the Sons of Horus start off strong. They continue on in the stories, but they don't necessarily stick the landing 100% of the time, which is why I'm placing the Sons of Horus as a solid A, first entry of this list. They have great stories and they have great background. There are some great books peppered throughout. There's great moments where you see them as protagonists and antagonists. A controversial novel that I actually really like is Slaves to Darkness. It shows some infighting between the Sons of Horus as Horus begins to make his final push for Terra. Saturnine is a great book from the perspective of Abaddon. The whole Siege of Terra actually does a great job of showing us why Abaddon is going to end up becoming who he becomes in the 40k universe. There's one really big problem and really big gripe that I have with the Sons of Horus lore, and I think shows up throughout the series. Where's Horus? Horus is... he's kind of important in the Horus Heresy, and he's really absent throughout a lot of the series. He shows up in little vignettes sometimes. He has moments where he intrudes on things. He shows up as a character, but he does very little of actual, protagonist work in the heresy which bears his name. And he's really absent in the siege itself. Now, admittedly, and of course, there's heavy spoilers here and throughout the whole of the video, Horus is kind of a hollowed out shell by the time that the story starts. And that has to do a lot to do with the events that occur in Slaves to Darkness, which is worth a read. So it makes sense in a certain way why he's pulled back. There's some lore purposes which do work. But still, for a character who is supposed to be so important, the book series are constantly mentioning how the other Primarchs all respected and loved him and why he was the perfect choice for the War Master. And then to have him be largely absent from the series, I don't think it's a choice that has worked so far. Now, there's going to be 2 more books in the series, the part 1 and 2 of the last chunk of the Horus Heresy series. We know that there is a big confrontation brewing between Horus and the Emperor and Sanguinius. So we know that something is going to happen. Will it be enough to, bring a successful cap on all of this? Abaddon's been kind of absent since Saturnine. Is he going to come back? I don't know. But there's still definitely great stuff to pull from. And if you're looking to build a Sons of Horus Legion, there's lots of different books and stories that you can pull from to get that bit of information. Next up, we have the Hater of Tyrants, the architect for the Edict of Nicaea in his own mind, and again, an all-around great guy. If you ask him, Mortarion and his legion, the Death Guard. I will tell you that the Death Guard were one of my first armies that I had in 40k, and I really, really was looking forward to seeing how they were portrayed in 30k, and it is with disappointment and sadness that I placed them in the C tier. A couple of good stories and then a bunch of other stuff. Let's start with the good. The Buried Dagger, which is the last book in the Horus Heresy series before the Siege of Terra, is a pretty good read. It really details what happens to the Death Guard right before they get to the Siege of Terra and what makes them the Death Guard that we know in the 40k universe. But it takes until the last book in the series for them to get a really fantastic standalone look. The Death Guard are present in other novels, in particular the White Scars series, as antagonists, and there's some good characterization and build there for Mortarion. And Mortarion features pretty prominently in Warhawk, which is a really good Siege of Terra book. However, the Death Guard, just in my opinion, they don't do necessarily as much as I would like to separate themselves from the mold. There are a couple things that are really interesting about Mortarion and the way he's built and the way he's discussed. So the big thing about his lore is the fact that he was found on this plague planet, this really evil entity, Xenos, Psyker, possibly Chaos, whatever thing, raises him, controls him, uses him, and then he discovers that humanity is something that is oppressed and he wants to undo things. And this is theoretically the reason why Mortarion sides with Horus, is because he views the Emperor as just another tyrant who is forcing everyone to live specifically under his rule set and his way of life. And I mean, if for nothing else but that, there is something interesting or compelling about that, because it is true that, the Imperium is a totalitarian environment. There's really no way to dispute that. And so, I mean, he is correct, at least in that regard. So as far as his how did we get here sort of story, we understand how he might feel the impulse to get involved in this sort of thing, but there's just tons of hypocrisy in Mortarion's character and his pride, and the fact that he, despite being so against all this magic and this psychic stuff and these other shenanigans, he goes and finds all this deep, dark, hidden lore, and he uses forbidden techniques to get what he wants, even before he ends up succumbing to chaos, which is, his well-established fate in the 40k universe. Now, that is actually not a bad character arc, but the thing is, it's really only about Mortarion, and there is not a lot of development for a lot of the other characters. At least it's not as prominent. There are a few that are mentioned consistently through the stories, and there's a couple that have a nice little payoff. Typhus, especially in Warhawk, but it's just not that great. It's not there like you feel you want it to be, especially if you're a big fan of this Legion. Now, Warhawk is great, in my opinion. There's a couple places in particular which really gets into, especially after their exposure to Nurgle and everything else, when they really truly start to become Plague Marines. There's a couple characters that have this introspective moments where they start thinking more clearly about, if we're truly even harder to kill than before, and we're really truly immortal now, what motivation do we have to do some of the things that we wanted to do before? What does any of this matter? And that's actually, that's a really interesting idea for me anyway. I found that really compelling. But again, it comes so late in everything else that's going on in the story. It's just not quite enough. I would like to see more of that from earlier on. Now, part of the problem with my opinion about the way that the Death Guard is portrayed and the way that it goes on throughout the stories, they are right there in the beginning of the lore. So obviously the chronological nature of the stories means that we're starting with Istvan 3 and then on to Istvan 5 by and large. So the stories, the Horus Heresy stories, are starting with those legions who were involved in the initial betrayal. So the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and of course the Emperor's Children. And well, you'll see how the organization goes out through the rest of this video, but whatever. Okay, so they're there from the start of the novel series unto the end. There are some legions that don't show up in the immediate events until later on, and they don't have as many of those cool big events they're tied to, so they don't get as many starting opportunities to do cool things and really shine. The Death Guard are right there from the very start, and so it is a little bit frustrating when they don't necessarily pan out in that way. As a counterexample to that, let's talk about the next one on the list, which is the Emperor's Children. Now, the Emperor's Children are right there from the start. We get to hear things about Fulgrim right away. We get stuff from Lucius. We meet a couple of the other characters. And it pays off because this is our very first S-tier rating. The flavor is real. The flavor is also salty, sweaty, briny, and a couple of other things that you don't really want to think too much about because of the nature of those Emperor's Children. Okay. This pick might end up being kind of controversial, and I wouldn't be terribly surprised about it, considering I talked to a couple different people about this, and I did get some pushback on this one, but let me state my case. And after all, if you want to have a differing opinion, please leave a comment below, or you can also set up your own average to below average YouTube channel and put your opinion out there as well. I strongly encourage it. Anyway, so the Emperor's Children are there from the very start. You have all these really interesting characters. You have Lucius, you have Fulgrim, you have Eidolon, Fabius Bile, Fabulous Bill, as some like to call him, and then there's more in between. And all these characters are different. They have very unique sense of identity and the motivations and the things that they want. They have unique stories and events that occur within the lore, and those journeys are all really different and special. On top of that, you have all of the things that are happening to this legion as they fall further and further and further into the deprivations of Slaanesh. But while all that's happening, they still get to keep that character and the wit and the cleverness and the silliness and the absurdity, like the utter absurdity. Like there's a passage in Angel Exterminatus where, Fulgrim is walking on the bodies of servants who are being crushed to death by his feet, and they are sighing in pleasure. It's ridiculous. And it's not just the full-on depravity as far as sex and stuff that a lot of people, the memes or whatever, will associate with Slaanesh. It's more than that. There's a more interesting thing going on there. The descriptions of the color, the presence of the sensation and how it messes with and affects all these different characters. It's fantastic. The other thing about it, for me, which is really special, is that the Emperor's Children are consistently interesting foils throughout the entirety of the series. They oftentimes, because of their writing, they can show up as bad guys even in stories that are about other traitors, because their motivations are very clearly their own and they have no sense to them whatsoever. They show up as foils for the Iron Warriors in Angels Exterminatus, which is one of my favorite books. They show up as foils in the White Scar series, in Path of Heaven. They feature prominently there. They are all over the place in those books, and they're a big part of some of the Siege of Terra as well. And it's just really, really interesting stuff, interesting description, and I love how absolutely over the top they are from top to bottom. This is the one legion that every time I read one of these books, and they are present in a lot of my favorite story arcs of the Horus Heresy series, I end up thinking, man, do I need to start Emperor's Children force? The answer is no, I don't. But man, I'm always tempted to. So for me, it's an easy S tier, because wherever they're placed in the story, they make the whole setting better. They're not simple. They have interesting motivations, even if it is just insanity. They make interesting things happen. They have interesting thoughts and things to say, and whatever they do ends up propelling the story along and making it better. So we're going to jump around a little bit here. Next up, if we're going with the Istvan 3 legions, we should be talking about the World Eaters, but I really want to save them for a little bit later. So instead, we're going to talk about the Iron Hands. Now, the Iron Hands, it's no secret that I think Ferrus Manus is maybe one of the worst parts about the Warhammer 40k, 30k, whatever setting. His name is Ferrus Manus, which basically just means Iron Hands. He has iron hands. He's the Legion head, or he's the head of the Legion, which is called Iron Hands. It's so lame. And there's a lot of naming conventions in Warhammer, in the Horus Heresy setting in general, that are pretty silly. There's a lot of things that just don't necessarily make sense. For example, Horus, the etymology of the name Horus would make more sense if it was attached to Magnus, who's the head of the Thousand Sons, and all the Egyptian stuff they have going on there. There's other problems. Corvus Corax is just like, his name is Raven, and he's the head of the Raven Guard, whatever. But Ferrus Manus, for whatever reason, has always had a special place in my heart as something that I just really thought was stupid. And so I'm really sorry to all the Iron Hands players out there. However, there's good news. The best thing that Ferrus Manus could have ever done for his Legion, as far as the lore and the excitement of reading them in the story, was die right away. So, Ferrus Manus dies. That Istvan 5. He's the big tragic, oh no. I can't remember what the name of the term is right now, but it's that thing that happens in stories where the bad guy kills somebody, so now that you know that the stakes are more serious. That's what happens to Ferrus Manus. He gets killed by Fulgrim, etc., etc. And then we're on with the races, and the Horus Heresy really kicks off and gets started. Now, I had always written the Iron Hands off, mostly because of my dislike for their Primarch. However, I actually have given them, I think, a pretty favorable place on my tier list. I put them at the B tier. They are consistent presence, and they are consistent in their description throughout the story. Now, basically all the Iron Hands end up in small little war bands doing their own thing, harrying the traitors as they go along in various different ways. But one of the interesting things about that Shattered Legions thing that they have going on is that there is, because of the desperation of what they're doing, the grim nature of all that's happening, there's a lot of really interesting stories that open up out of that possibility. Now, I would never be really compelled to play the Iron Hands, I don't think, but I do appreciate the fact that they get a unique sort of situation and place within the story and the lore. Now, the Raven Guard and the Salamanders both they kind of undergo similar things as far as the shellacking they receive from, Istvan 5, but the Iron Hands, because of their unique relationship with the Primarch, which part of the story there is that apparently there were already some people in the Legion who were unhappy with some of the choices and decisions that Ferrus had made about the Legion's propensity to remove their flesh and replace it with augmetics. Some of them want to replace more or all of their flesh with augmetics. Some of them want very little. Ferrus was in that camp. So there's already a division and a line and a little bit of hostility within the own Legion itself. And all of that tension and all of that idea, it makes for some really interesting moments. So you get a group, I believe it's the Sisyphean. They're some minor characters that bump around, and they are present in Angel Exterminatus, again, one of my favorites, and a bunch of other stories. And then they get a nice little final send-off in Sons of the Selenar, a short story in the Horus Heresy series, the Siege of Terra series. And I just think, I think the writers, I think they did a good job of organizing that story, keeping it consistent and making that flavor something fun, because it would be really easy just to write them off or just ignore them entirely and move on with other things. But I like the idea that the authors persisted and made something out of what could have been nothing. So I think a B tier is, maybe it's a little high, but I think it's well deserved. Now, next up is a Legion that's close and dear to my bitter heart. The Iron Warriors. Full disclosure, this is the first Legion that I played in Horus Heresy. I absolutely love them. Apparently, at least looking at the little bit of data that I collected to go along with this video, so do a lot of you, because they're one of the most prominently played Legions, which makes sense considering that you can basically rattle can Leadbelcher onto some models, hit it with some washes and some highlights, and you got a pretty nice little tabletop army. But regardless, I love the Iron Warriors, and I put them at a solid A. I actually had them at they'll end up being the first tier of that A tier, with great stories and background. I really like the way that the Iron Warriors are portrayed. I think the books do a pretty good job of separating the Iron Warriors out from the other Chaos Legions and explaining a little bit about why they end up in the place that they are. So a big crux of what the Iron Warriors are upset about has to do with the fact that the Imperial Fists do kind of what they do, but just get way more attention out of it. And that's a very vast oversimplification. But Perturabo and the Iron Warriors end up on these terrible siege fronts, these war footings that are endless grinds, lots of casualties, real not fun, not glamorous warfare, and they feel like they don't get anything out of it. Perturabo is also very clearly and consistently defined as being a character who seems to have a difficult time relating to the emotions of others, or understanding and perceiving the emotions of others. Sometimes in almost too silly of a way, but usually they do a pretty good job of keeping it under wraps and under control. But it's almost as if, he decides that he's going to become traitor and the Legion follows him. It's very clear. There are several points in the story where he's more or less like I'm still there because I made the choice and I'm going to stick with it, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense for him to do so. Angel Exterminatus is a book that it's my favorite Horus Heresy. No, is it my favorite Horus Heresy book? I don't know. It's really hard for me to say, but it's one of my favorites. It really gets at the idea of Perturabo as he sees himself and what he wishes to be, and it's all about his very interesting banter with Fulgrim. And one of the things that I love about that book, and a large number of other books, and of course one of the reasons why I rated The Emperor's Children so highly, the writers of this series, a lot of times they do a really great job. Or I should say, the books where they do a good job of this are the books that do really well. When you place characters in opposition to each other, and you are able to describe their antics, their abilities, their thoughts, their whatever, in comparison with someone who is opposite to them or opposing to them, this is called a foil in literature. And it really, really does a great job of comparing and describing both characters at the same time in a way that's entertaining. It helps the audience understand what's going on. And Perturabo makes a great foil for a lot of characters because of the fact that he is so different from so many of the other traitor Primarchs. By the time they get to Terra, Mortarion, Angron, Fulgrim are all... Oh, and Magnus. Don't forget Magnus. They're all demonified, very difficult to understand, control, talk to, or whatever. Horus is pretty much absent, more or less. And then it's basically just Perturabo, who's trying to plan the siege, try to put things in order. And as the books tick along, especially in those early books, you get to see more and more him attempt to make sense of something that doesn't really make sense anymore. And you get to see his troops try to do the same thing. There are so many great supporting character Iron Warriors as well. Foryx, Fulk. I like Kroger. I was surprised. The first time I read Angel Exterminatus, I thought he was just kind of silly. But I do like Kroger after rereading it and then rereading The First Wall. And we can't, of course, forget Barbas D'Antioch, the awesome loyalist warsmith, who is such an interesting character. He's crippled, he's disgraced, but he manages to do so much in his attempt to stay loyal, and he's got a really cool send-off as well in this story. There's a lot of depth here, in my opinion, and especially considering that so much of what the Traitor Legions become by the end of the series is just stark raving lunacy in one flavor or another. It's kind of fun just to see a little bit of that counterexample, and I think it's a nice palate cleanser. For me, Iron Warriors, easy A rating. Now, next up is one that I'm gonna probably catch a little bit of crap from some of my friends. The Raven Guard. Okay, so all of the Istvan 5 Loyalist Legions have it rough. By design in the narrative, they get stomped, and then they've got to, figure out what to do for themselves. I don't like the Raven Guard books. I don't like the stories. I don't find them interesting. Deliverance Lost. It showed up as someone's favorite book in a survey that I did, and I respect you for loving that book. I think the content and the idea is really cool. Deliverance Lost starts off on Istvan with the Raven Guard escaping. the massacre with the very few soldiers that they have left. It's a great idea. It's a cool idea. I tried to read that book 4 times and I couldn't get through it. I didn't like it. Now, when I started reading these books and then when I finished them, I ended up doing a lot of audiobooks because life being what it is, I don't necessarily have time to sit down and read when I'm not doing it for work. But afterwards, I was looking up and I was trying to look at some things in preparation for this video, try to look at some different authors. I knew that Chris Raitt, for example, was Raitt, I think it's Raitt, was responsible for the White Scars arc, and I think he did a great job with it, and we'll get to that when we get to that. Gav Thorpe is responsible for a lot of the Raven Guard stuff, and I do not think he does a great job with it. That is why the Raven Guard get a rating in the D tier. The very first one, the Raven Guard are Thorped. I don't really have much else to say about it other than that. Now, Shuriken himself, probably a C tier character, maybe even a B tier character. He's really interesting. He has some cool stories, but for my mileage, that was it. That was it, in my opinion. I want you to imagine a Nikona Shuriken emblem somewhere in the middle or the top of this chart. It just didn't feel right to bury him with the rest of his legion. I mean, he had a cool fight against Lucius. He had a couple of other awesome moments in the story series, but that's all I can say about that. Sorry. Next up is another one of my favorites, the Night Lords. I absolutely love this legion. I have not started working on a Night Lord's force, but I definitely will at some point. I've always thought they were cool. I loved the design. I love the color. And I do love the lore as well. This one was a little bit trickier for me to do because the first draft, I actually put them pretty low, like a C, maybe even almost a D, because they're not in that many of the stories. A lot of the stories that they are in, they're involved in the Thramis Crusade campaign, and those stories I don't think are particularly well fleshed out or well written, which we'll talk about later. But there's a couple of really cool moments. I ended up settling on a B score for these guys, which of course is a consistent presence and story. And maybe be more accurate just to say consistent story, because they're not a consistent presence throughout the series. They come and go. They're involved heavily in a few arcs, and then fairly non-existent. Again, just like the Istvan Legions, the Night Lords have a problem in the fact that they leave Istvan 5, they kind of go off and do their own thing, and then they're basically just a splinter fleet by the end of the Horus Heresy, and they're involved. Gender Grybok is a fun character who ends up making it to the Siege of Terra. There are, other characters, of course, as well. I really like Conrad Curris, and I'm working on another video just about him, actually, because I think his unique moral quandary involving his prescience and his fate, according to what he thinks that he's supposed to or was created to do, whether or not he should be considered guilty of the crimes that he commits, that's a really interesting concept to me. The biggest thing, though, is that I think Sevatar is a fantastic character. He's the captain of the first company, the Atramentar, which are this famous and awesome Terminator company. He has fantastic rules in the book, which make him and mark him as one of the best fighters in the Imperium. There's this awesome lore moment which talks about a duel between Sevatar and, Sigismund. And in that lore, it lasts for, an ungodly and stupid amount of time, like a 24-hour duel or something ridiculous. But then it ends when Sevatar cheats and headsbutts Sigismund, and everyone else is outraged except for Sigismund, who laughs. On top of that, he has a very specific sense of honor. He has the red gloves, which mark him as a murderer or a criminal of the highest kind, a betrayer of his group, and basically his life is forever forfeit to Conrad Kurz if Kurz wishes to claim it. And so he just lives with his judgment always, but he continues to follow his master, and oftentimes does things that he knows are stupid just out of loyalty, which is really bizarre in a legion that is known for having absolutely no loyalty or sanity in it. He's a lot of fun, and his stories are well played out. and I really hope he gets more screen time in the Heresy. But he's very honorable in his own very specific Night Lord way, and it shows up in the way he interacts with Conrad Kurz, and the way he interacts with his peers, and the things that he tries to do for his murderous, disgusting legion of turncoats. The Sevatar novella, I think it's my favorite one of the entire series, and that's backed up by the data that I pulled of all the respondents that I asked. The only two that consistently showed up in any number were the Sevatar short story, The Prince of Crows, and then The Last Church, which is that really interesting short story about the Emperor talking to the last priest on Earth. Sevatar's great, and there is a lot of emotional depth and concern and question, and, in a setting that is all about the grim nature of humanity's choices and the consequences that come around because of those, in a setting where even the good guys are definitely not the good guys. The Night Lords are the perfect example of good guys that were never good guys, but they know it at least. There's a couple of really fantastic moments. The book Pharos, which is not one that shows up on many people's favorite to read, but if you can get a hold of the audiobook and you can tolerate sort of bad Russian accents, fake Russian accents, it's really entertaining. The Night Lords are just like hilariously mustache-twirling villains in that regard. And some of the characters are just, I don't know, there's just a lot of fun to be had with that legion. But they're not present, really. They're not a main factor in the Siege of Terra. They're not present in a lot of other things. And perhaps because of their unique perspective on the morality of the things they're doing, the fact that they don't necessarily have service to a specific chaos god, they don't necessarily fit in with the larger narrative. They're sort of an odd chunk on the outside, so maybe it's appropriate that they're not necessarily at the center of everything. But regardless, a B for me, definitely good flavor. And if you've never read Sevatar, I suggest you go do that immediately. Next up, we have the Salamanders, which, this is the last of the Istvan 5 survivors, and they are going to occupy what's going to end up being a pretty crowded C tier here. They definitely have a couple of good stories and then a bunch of other stuff. They do have their own novel series. They've got, there's Vulcan Lives, there's Old Earth, there's some Vulcan-centric things, there's some interesting characters. None of it really spoke to me personally, although I do love Vulcan's moment in Echoes of Eternity, the latest, as of the recording of this video, Horus Heresy novel. But, again, just not a lot there, not a lot going on. My biggest, I don't want to say problem, but the interesting thing about the Salamanders is the way that they sort of straddle the line between good guys and whatever else. I mean, they're still Space Marines, but there's always this attempt and this push, maybe just by the community, to humanize them more than some other legions. And while the internal struggle or the psychological struggle of some of the characters or Primarchs does in fact make them more interesting, I think Mortarion benefits from this. I think the Khan, who we'll talk about later, benefits from this. Perturabo, Magnus, I guess, to a certain extent. The humanization of the Salamanders does not exactly sit right with me, because they're still killers and everything else, just like every other Space Marine is. Let me know what I'm missing there, please, because I would like to know more about the Salamanders or appreciate them more. I've got a buddy who plays them and does a good job playing them, and I do like seeing them on the table, but, tell me what I'm missing. Tell me what I'm wrong about there. Buzzing right along, another C entry is the Alpha Legion. And it's the same as before, a couple of good stories and then some other things. It's really actually just a couple of stories that are really good, and then almost nothing whatsoever. The Alpha Legion, because of what they're supposed to be, are in a really lousy spot as far as what you're supposed to do to characterize them. Legion is one of the first 10 books in the Horus Heresy series, and it is really, really popular. It's really popular among people who aren't even Alpha Legion players. People just really enjoy that story. For those of you who don't know, it sort of introduces a storyline that is... Not everybody appreciates the story about the Perpetuals and whatever else, but it's this idea of another set of powerful influences who are trying to manipulate what goes on with the Imperium of Man, and how they want to shape the Horus Heresy. The Alpha Legion try to play both sides like they do. And Legion is a really good book. A lot of it is done through the perspective of humans who are part of the Great Crusade forces and how they interact with the Legion in order to assist them and help them accomplish their goals. And it's a very entertaining book. It opens up some interesting things, and I remember reading it when I read it in the series and being like, wow, this is a really bold new take on the Horus Heresy lore, and it opens up a lot of interesting possibilities. Here is the thing about the Alpha Legion that is sort of a problem. The whole, double, triple, quadruple blind thing that the Alpha Legion has going on, games within games, it's a really interesting idea, but it's kind of difficult to see how it plays into a 50-some book series when part of the mystique of the Alpha Legion is that no one really knows what it is that they're doing or what's going on. There are other good books. Praetorian of Dorn is an Alpha Legion versus Imperial Fist book, which I really, really enjoyed as well. It kind of has some other examples of the kind of infiltration stuff that the Alpha Legion would do. It suffers a little bit from some of the same problems that I think the Raven Guard do sometimes, which is sometimes I'm reading those books and hearing about these Space Marines sneaking around. I'm like, wait, aren't these dudes 8 feet tall and wearing basically cars on their bodies, full engines? It's funny how they always talk about the hum of Mark IV plate or whatever else, the sound of everything, and then the idea of these guys tiptoeing around. Anyway, I'm getting off track. The Alpha Legion is cool. It is flavorful. And there are a couple of places where you can look for that sort of idea and information. But by necessity, there isn't a lot written about them, because the more you write about them, the more you set into canon. And the more you set into canon, the less you can say about the mysterious motivations and what they're doing in different places. One of the things that's nice about that is that if you're trying to look for inspiration on how to build your specific force, you have a lot of leeway, because you can basically, it's easy to say in canon, basically, that anything you can imagine, this Alpha Legion force was operating there as well, too. And there are very few ways or places that someone can say, well, that really doesn't fit the narrative. So it's really fun. It's sort of a creative playground for you. But there's not a lot of specific stuff in the books that ties you to any one specific place. So go ahead and check back sometime soon for part 2 of this video, where we wrap up the rest of the legions. And we'll have a little bit more to talk about some of the data that I was able to pull from that survey. Take a look at what people play, and then also what people really like. Because, there are definitely some stories that very clearly you can see this is the legion someone likes, and these are the books that they read, and there's a definite correspondence. But there's a couple of Owens out there that are really, really interesting outliers. And that definitely means that if you're new to the Horus Heresy or new to the lore, that's the place I'd suggest to send you first. Alright, take care. Talk to you next time.